The offshoot of the Senate subcommittee hearing on comics was the creation, in the following fall, of the Comics Magazine Association of America. This association, like the one before it, was voluntary. The difference lay in the comic book czar, Judge Charles F. Murphy, who came from outside the industry. Judge Murphy's charge was to enforce the Code for Editorial Matter, and comic book publishers wishing to carry the Comics Code of Authority seal of approval had to submit their material, pre-publication, to Judge Murphy's eye. Now, not all publishers underwent this process. Dell and Gold Key Comics, for example, reasoning that their brands alone were enough to assure parents that the material contained within the covers of their comics was without reproach, never underwent the Comics Code approval. Other publishers, reasoning that they never offered their material to children in the first place, also avoided the code. But the vast majority of comic book publishers submitted their material to the editorial standards, and these standards were stringent. I have here an edited list. General Standards, Part A, Crime. Number 6. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. General Standards, Part B, Horror. 4. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. Number 5, scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. Cutting down to marriage and sex. Number 5, passion or romantic interest shall never be treated in such a way as to stimulate the lower and baser emotions. Finally, the Code for Advertising Matter. Number 9, advertisements of medical, health, or toiletry products of questionable nature are to be rejected. Advertisements for medical, health, or toiletry products endorsed by the American Medical Association or the American Dental Association shall be deemed acceptable if they conform with all other conditions of the advertising code. The problem here is not simply with a list of codes. Indeed, the code does not prohibit the creation of great storytelling. And as EC soldiered on, it created a new direction. And here is Impact Magazine of 1955, a comic that contains perhaps EC's best story of all time. This story, Bernard Kriegstein's Master Race, is a story of the Holocaust and of vengeance. It demonstrates that even in the post-code reality, great storytelling, great comics art is possible. However, the code was flawed. And its flaw, I argue, lies in its ability and its attempt to corral artistic intention and readerly interpretation. In fact, the code writes a system in which it interprets the story ahead of time, defining the artist's intention and judging it before publication. It attempts to get in the way of the reader and the artist and assumes that it can tell what the reader makes of a story. Example. In addition to Impact Magazine, EC attempted to retrofit a number of its existing comics. Here is Incredible Science Fiction, and it bears the comic book code of approval. Incredible Science Fiction, in fact, reprints tales from Weird Fantasy. EC had to get rid of the name Weird Fantasy because weird was not allowed by the Comics Code Authority. And so, Incredible Science Fiction was created, and it contained the story Judgment Day, a weird fantasy story reprinted in this new title. The story Judgment Day is of a helmeted astronaut who lands on a planet of robots. The astronaut is there to judge whether the robots are ready to join the Federation of Planets. He has to make a consideration of their level of civilization. The robots are orange and blue, divided by colors. The orange ones are the nobler race, and control the blue ones. The orange ones segregate themselves because they find the blue ones distasteful. Ultimately, the astronaut deems this unacceptable and charges the robots to civilize themselves. They are unready to join the Federation. When Bill Gaines submitted the artwork for this comic to Judge Charles Murphy rejected the comic based on the last and final panel. This panel, illustrated here, shows that the helmeted astronaut is ultimately African American. This is the famous EC jolt. It forces the reader to reevaluate the story and reflect on the nature of segregation overall. Indeed, the last panel demands that the reader go back to the beginning of the comic and think about the story overall. Let us turn to the first page. Here, in the first panel, the story begins. The man roared down from the night sky. He'd come from the infinite void of space, across the endless cosmic vacuum. He'd come from the planet Earth. He'd come in a ship of gleaming alloys, belching blue flames and yellow clouds of atomic dust, and he'd come alone. He'd stepped to the port amid the cheers of the robot population. Welcome, welcome, Earthman, to Siberia, to the planet of mechanical life. The man stepped from his gleaming ship. He stepped into the artificial sunlight that flooded the landing site. He extended his hand. I am Tartan, from Earth colonization. I am here to inspect. If I find that you are ready, we are ready. We have labored long and hard to perfect our society. We have experimented and discovered, planned and built, asked and answered. We are ready. Tartan moved forward through the crowd of orange robots that pressed around him. He stopped and questioned one. Do you know who I am? You are Tartan from Earth. You are a representative of our original creators. If you find that we are ready, all of the wonders and greatness of Earth will be ours. The story has an interesting opening because no sooner does Tartan tell the robots who he is than he asks a second time, do you know who I am? This robot, of course, knows who I am. He's just been told this is Tartan from Earth, and so he simply repeats that information. The robot does not have the knowledge of reflection. And as readers, we are in the robot's position. Just as the robot cannot reflect on its own social organization, we, as readers, at that time in 1953, live in a world of segregation. But we as readers also do not know that Tartan is African American, so we do not know who he is. In the larger sense, this story is about self-knowledge. It's about reflecting on our society and ourselves. It's a story of self-reflection. The last panel triggers that self-reflection and forces the reader back to the beginning to understand the whole picture again in a way that the robot citizens are unable at that point. The story then asks that the reader civilize him or herself. Judge Murphy initially rejected the piece based on the last panel. Gaines fought him, and Murphy hedged, arguing that the last panel showed too many beads of sweat on the astronaut's face. Gaines fought again, fought, and this shows that Murphy's interpretation of the text ultimately was not so much based on its overall thematic argument for civilization. It was based on Murphy's predisposition to see EC Comics as a troublemaker, as the enemy, as something that needed to be sanitized. And so, the problem with regulation is not simply a list of prohibiting rules The problem is that it depends on human interpretation to enact those rules, and human interpretation will always move beyond them. So, nevertheless, the Comics Code Authority ruled comics. And throughout the 1950s, there was a tremendous decline. 18 publishers left the industry. Monthly titles fell from 696 in 1952 to somewhere around 300 after the Comics Code of Authority. To pull together this lecture and synthesize it with last week's lectures, I'd like to revise my fictional essays introduction. My new title, instead of Inoculated Identity, is Big Brother Steps In. My topic is broad. Comics are part of American culture. My argument still is that the syringe is a metaphor for comics. And I would, if I were writing this out as an essay, argue that Captain America and Murder, Morphine, and Me give us ways of understanding the virulence of comics, give us ways of understanding how comics allow us to imagine a perfect identity, but to also blur reality, to draw us into a world of addiction. And so my sub-thesis is that art and propaganda are technologies of the imagination, and as my argument builds, I would suggest that these technologies are deeply worried. They're ways of thinking about what's within inside us. In the 40s and 50s, America was worried about the fifth column. Thus, I come to my argument, comics are part of American Cold War culture. And I come to my thesis again, comics are a virulent art. But because I've thought about this thesis, I can answer a new question. So what? Why does it matter that comics are part of a virulent art? Well, perhaps I could only take this argument as far as a virulent art before, but now I've thought about my issue further. And so I would say the answer to, so what? Why is this an important thesis? The answer is art is not pure. It exists in a continual struggle between containment and creativity. This struggle is played out in a number of different ways. One way is the question of censorship.